Before I get into the meat of this video, I've tried my best to explain everything not rail related in this video. However, some degree of modern history is required for the most enjoyment. The bulk of this video is also alternate history. These are conclusions I have drawn and are not solid facts. This will become very prevalent towards the second half of the video. Enjoy! World War II was the largest conflict the world has ever seen. An estimated 70 to 85 million people passed away during the conflict, with the bulk of deaths being civilians. In the Pacific, Australia and New Zealand were major Allied outposts, and most of Australia's industries were commandeered to feed the war effort. Many technological advancements also occurred during the war. So in today's video, I'll be exploring what the Victorian railways and Victoria could look like if World War II never happened. Context. Most of you probably have some sort of knowledge of the events of World War II, but for those who don't, here's a very brief recap. Mustache Man rose to power in 1933 with some interesting ideas, so he started rearming Germany as well as taking a few lands. Germany then befriended Japan, who invaded China. Then Germany attacked Poland and the war in Europe started, as England and France had enough. Western mainland Europe was swiftly captured, as well as the bulk of the East. In June 1941, the Soviets got invaded, with the largest ground invasion in history, and Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, bringing the US into direct combat, and everything started to crumble. But not before the Japanese scooped up all of Southeast Asia. Now it's late 1943, the Allies landed in Italy, and the Soviets also started pushing the Germans back. In 1944, the Allies landed in France, and the Russians reached Berlin in April 1945, and the Germans surrendered soon after. From 1942 to 1945, the Allies were also liberating Southeast Asia. Then two big A-bombs were dropped on two Japanese cities, and the destructive war came to a close. So in this alternate timeline, none of that happens. There are countless videos online that explain how it might have happened in significantly more detail, so I won't go through much here. Maybe appeasement might have actually worked, or Mustache Man was cooed, but what I want to talk about is what the world would look like if it didn't happen. The US wouldn't become the major superpower that it is today. They would be strong, but they wouldn't be dominant. Similarly, the Cold War would look different. The Eastern Bloc wouldn't exist, which was a group of communist states in Eastern Europe. The spread of communism would be more contained, and most importantly, the nuclear age would be significantly slowed. The power of the atom would most likely be contained to just energy production rather than bombs. However, nuclear weapons would definitely still exist. Looking at the rest of Europe, decolonization would have likely been slower, and the European powers would have had the resources to keep their colonies in line. And without pressure from international bodies like the United Nations, we would have seen colonial rule up to the early 2000s. If the Japanese invasion of China did not occur, and I personally count it as a part of World War II, then the Chinese Civil War would have turned out differently, with the nationalists winning over the communists. With a weaker Soviet Union and no Chinese Civil War, other conflicts wouldn't happen, like the Vietnam and Korean Wars. Looking closer to home, Australia wouldn't have the Populate or Perish campaign, which saw us taking in millions of refugees from Europe, mainly Britain and Ireland, but we also had an influx of Greek, Italians and Slavs. Australia most likely would have been a British dominion for much longer, as the war in the Pacific significantly soured Australia's opinion on the British. Australia's biggest trading partner would also still likely be the British, without the dominance of the Chinese in the modern era. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed by the UN, and without the UN it would not have been passed, as the UN only exists because of the aftermath of World War II. Although we probably would have seen some sort of international body today, perhaps the League of Nations would still exist. Civil rights movements would have occurred later or not at all, so the White Australia policy would have been in place for much longer. Aside from politics, World War II supercharged the use of synthetic fuels. Civilian road technology wouldn't have been developed as quickly, and rail would have been much more dominant. Without these advancements, we would see much more maritime travel. We would also not see major developments in things like radar or electronic computers, delaying the computer age for a few years or even decades. Without the rise in fuel usage, would we have a consensus on global warming? It's difficult to imagine, but with nuclear being used as a means of energy production and no oil boom, I believe society wouldn't need to worry too much about the climate. By the time we do realize the harm fossil fuels cause, it'll be significantly easier to phase them out. Globalization will be slower, and Australia would be more self-contained. In 1939, the world was still feeling the effects of the Great Depression, and Victoria was no different. The Great Depression likely would have dragged on for longer, as the USA's massive amount of military spending once the war kicked off dragged the US economy out of the mud. Now that we have a basic outline of the world, what would the railways look like? The railways. So how does any of this actually affect the Victorian railways? Well, without World War II, maintenance around the network is allowed to be carried out. Operation Phoenix, the post-war modernization plan, would likely have been cut back and be slightly different, specifically without the inclusion of diesel locomotives. This is because there was nothing to repair, but there are a few things that could be modernized. Since fuel isn't developed, we would rely more heavily on coal and then electricity. In the 1950s and 60s, many of the rail lines were closed due to being replaced by roads. Unfortunately, this would still be the case. We would overall see a decrease in road infrastructure if World War II did not occur. In the short term, we would see an increase due to an increase in factories for commercial use, rather than being converted for military use. However, in the long term, highway expansion, suburbanization, and the oil boom that World War II brought would not exist. The car also supercharged our industries, but it's hard to tell if we would lean towards an even more agricultural or industrial society. Present day, we are an agricultural state, growing 90% of Australia's pears, among other foods. So with a less industrialized Melbourne combined with a rural population, we would most definitely be an agricultural state. With less road development, goods would still be more efficiently transported by trains, so you would see less line closures in future. Looking at population growth, by 1940 people were already centralizing, with 1.1 million people living in Melbourne and about 750,000 living in regional Victoria, with Melbourne experiencing a 1.6% yearly growth, while regional Victoria experienced about half of that at 0.8. I'd expect that trend to continue, so if my math is right, in 2025, keep in mind these numbers are without any immigration, Melbourne would have a modest population of 3 million, with 1.2 million people who live in regional Victoria. 3 million is roughly 2 million off of Melbourne's population today, and about 400,000 less in regional Victoria. So the most rural and unused lines would be knocked off in the late 40s, but most lines would be retained well into the 1960s. There is also the issue of gauge conversions. I'd expect the Melbourne to Sydney main line to be converted earlier. The standard gauge line down to the Bandiana Army base most likely wouldn't have been constructed at all, as troop trains didn't need to run anymore. The Queenscliff line at the entrance of Port Phillip Bay wouldn't have seen a revival. The line was used to carry mines to the Swan Island military base during World War II. I'll go into more detail when I make a video on the Queenscliff line, but the line wouldn't have seen a traffic boost. It would have likely closed in the 1960s. In my last video, I talked about the Ashworth Improvement Plan, which was delayed and mostly canned due to the war. We would likely see most, if not all, the projects built today. Victoria as a whole wasn't really affected by the war. Sure, everything got halted for a decade, but we are lucky that combat never made it here, especially in other nations where other cities basically had to rebuild the bulk of infrastructure. Looking at you, Warsaw, Dresden, Berlin, and Tokyo, most of which exceeded 50% of their total land area reduced to flat rubble. Especially Warsaw, which about 80 to 90% of it was destroyed. What would the VR look like today? Well, we would most likely see a larger VR with more rail lines still open. We would likely see a rise in truck usage, but not as large. In Melbourne, we would have a smaller city, with less development all around. The current system of transporting goods by rail involves bulk goods and intermodal containers. Given the lower reliance on roads, we might see shorter goods trains and more variety. I'd expect some more rail lines to be opened today in regional Victoria, and more passenger services. Not a major, almost fantasy-like amount, but busier, product-producing lines to areas which export bulk materials, like Yarram, Mount Gambier, East Natimuc, Colbernabin, Bright, Maffra, Mansfield, Mornington, Hillsville, Daylesford, and Wonthaggi. All of these lines export food, grain, and have some sort of tourism value. In the case of Wonthaggi, I'd expect the state coal mine to still be active a little later, as in this universe, the steam era is likely to have lasted a little longer, especially as diesels wouldn't be implemented until later. As in real life, the order of diesels was a last-minute decision. With nuclear being used for energy production rather than a weapon, Australia might actually see its first nuclear power plants open up, with an even bigger focus on electrification. Historically, the only line to be electrified outside of Melbourne was the Traralgon line. With more nuclear power plants dotted around the state, we might even see the Geelong line electrified and certainly other interurban locations like Ballarat or Bendigo, and even outer suburban lines like Hillsville or Mornington. Regarding the suburban area, I have made a map of what I believe we would see in the modern day. All of the proposals on this map were made with the belief that Melbourne's population is sitting at around 3 million, as well as other factors if World War II did not occur. So Melbourne would look like what it did in the 90s. Comparing modern day to the 1990s, areas such as Woollett, Mernda, Craigieburn, Windvale, Cranbourne and Pakenham are still flat farmland. So in this universe without World War II, we're just gonna say that Melbourne would still develop the same exact way, just later. So with more time to build up existing suburbs, rather than trying to mass produce suburbs, I expect the areas which are developed to be more so. So areas like Doncaster, Warrandyte, Rowville and Deer Park would all get rail lines, or at least electrified suburban lines, especially with less reliance on cars. Little changes have been implemented here and there, like Cardinia Road being removed, as the Pakenham area is just too underdeveloped for it to exist. I have added a station at Eltham North, as the area would most likely be more developed, with more time to slowly expand. Southland Station in this universe is now Pennydale, since without American influence, Melbourne's shopping centres or shopping situation would look different. Instead of giant mega malls, we would have smaller shopping streets, more akin to the British. I want to specifically point out the Essendon Airport line. Development of jet engines was accelerated by World War II, so without it, jet engines would have come into fashion a lot later, possibly late 60s. This just means less reliance on air transport, and more focus on maritime travel. Thus, Williamstown Pier and Port Melbourne are still in operation. By the 2020s, I expect Melbourne Airport to have been built, but it might have been smaller and closer to the city given the lack of road infrastructure. Moorabbin Airport has the space to expand, and maybe Moorabbin was just expanded instead of building a new airport. An Essendon Airport line would have been created, as well as a much more expanded Essendon. The line would be simple to build, as CityLink most likely wouldn't have existed. Which is the next point. How developed would Melbourne's road network actually be? We wouldn't really have an Americanized ideology. Cars were already very prevalent by the 1940s. However, I believe that freeways and massive expansive roads wouldn't define the city. Rather, roads would act in a similar fashion to riding a bike, and would be much more primitive. The car would take you moderate distances, like from suburb to the shopping street, or to the train station. However, longer journeys would be accomplished by tram and railways. Unlike today, most people would work in the CBD and take the train home at the end of the day, which is why so many radial lines exist. For cross-city journeys, I believe the tram network could be expanded dramatically, or a cross-city rail line would be built on the land reserve where the M80 ring road would have been. For more rural locations, the car would be used. Back to the map, you can see outer suburban extensions have also been axed. Cranbourne, Mernda, Craigieburn and Sunbury, as these areas just don't have the development to have a suburban service yet. Although it is a toss-up if the Cranbourne line is electrified or not. For the purposes of this map, I have not included it. Looking at the individual lines, the main noticeable one is the North-South link, mainly because I put it in neon green, but it's also notable as the inner circle is still around. Technically, the North-South link is a 1954 project. However, a similar plan was proposed in 1929 by the Metropolitan Town Planning Commission. Philip Mallis has made a more comprehensive video on it, which I recommend you watch after this one. The plan was to definitely link the Mernda and maybe Upfield and Hurstbridge lines to the St Kilda and Port Melbourne lines, with a new rail bridge from Spencer Street to the junction of the St Kilda and Port Melbourne lines, which would have made this area a mess of flyovers and crossovers. However, it would have been a cool train spotting spot. Another addition is the proposed Fisherman's Bend rail loop, which is more of an unlikely addition. However, with expanded maritime travel, I expect the area to be busy. Areas such as Docklands would probably still be redeveloped in future when the railways inevitably move out. However, Victoria Dock would most likely still be used as a passenger port, or at least more so. If the loop is constructed, we wouldn't have seen the Webb Dock line and a different Metro Tunnel 2 proposal. We probably wouldn't even see Metro Tunnel 1 as the City Loop is completely different. Speaking of the City Loop, it's similar to the Ashworth proposal, with a tunnel portal at Princess Bridge, and yes, it would still be around, or at the very least, fully integrated into Flinders Street Station. Unlike the Ashworth plan where the City Loop was originally going to connect with the St Kilda line, my proposal has it connect with the Burnley Group. The Ashworth proposal also has the tunnel travel north under Swanston Street rather than Spring Street, which is what we have today. Now, I have this tunnel connected to the Bridge Road tunnel, while in the Ashworth proposal it connects to the Burnley group. Maybe when it was built it through ran with the Burnley group. However, we would see the 5 suburban lines become increasingly overcrowded, and I believe an extra line would be built on top of the Burnley quadding. So that's what I have pictured here. A rail line from Hawthorn under Bridge Road to a quadded Jolimont station. This tunnel carries both the Alamein and Warrandyte lines to through run with Craigieburn. A few things had to be modified from the Ashworth proposal to make this work. Camberwell quadding would be slightly different. It would still happen, however just without the Q flyover. Something not pictured on this map is Jolimont Yards. It most likely still would be around today, as the Ashworth plan has it roofed over. If it is shut down and the underground part is just converted to more city, then it could become a major tourist attraction for Melbourne, being like a double-decker city. The VR trams are also pictured here, given that the lack of tourism during the war killed these lines, as well as the lack of maintenance. It's likely they would still be around today, perhaps they would be sold to the M&MTB, who knows. Thank you all for watching. The map pictured in this video is free to download in the description below. I know this video is slightly different from what I usually make, but if you guys enjoyed it, I will make more. If you want a place to hang out and chat, consider joining the Discord server. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all later.